Sarah Martinez had been a military nurse for 8 years, but the limp in her left leg told a story she wished she could forget. 3 months ago, during a convoy attack in Afghanistan, shrapnel from an improvised explosive device had torn through her leg, leaving her with permanent damage that ended her frontline service dreams. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Bastion as Sarah made her way to the medical station. Each step sent a dull ache through her leg, a constant reminder of that terrible day when her Humvee hit the roadside bomb. She had been returning from a remote outpost where she had treated wounded soldiers, doing what she loved most, saving lives under impossible conditions. "Martinez, you're on base duty again today," Colonel Harris announced without looking up from his paperwork. The word stung more than her physical pain. Base duty meant staying behind while other medical teams flew out on rescue missions. It meant watching helicopters disappear into the distance, carrying her colleagues to help wounded soldiers while she sorted medical supplies and filed reports. Sarah limped to her assigned desk in the corner of the medical bay. Around her, the sounds of preparation filled the air. Medics checked their equipment, pilots reviewed flight plans, and rescue teams coordinated their missions. She had once been part of this energy, this purpose. Now she felt like a broken piece of machinery, useful only for tasks that others found tedious. The other nurses treated her kindly, but Sarah could see the pity in their eyes. Lieutenant Johnson, who had arrived just 2 months ago, was already flying rescue missions that Sarah once led. Captain Williams, her former partner, now worked with someone new. Everyone was professional and respectful, but Sarah felt invisible, forgotten. Her desk was positioned near the radio communications center, where she could hear every emergency call that came in. Each crackling voice reporting casualties, each request for medical evacuation, reminded her of the work she could no longer do. The irony was cruel. Her experience and skills were exactly what field teams needed, but her damaged leg made her a liability in combat zones. Another convoy hit an IED about 40 clicks north. She overheard Sergeant Rodriguez telling the flight coordinator. "Multiple casualties, they're requesting immediate medical support." Sarah watched through the window as teams rushed to their helicopters, her hands unconsciously clenching into fists. She knew she could help those soldiers, knew she could make a difference, but regulations kept her grounded. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the small garden area behind the medical facility. She had discovered this quiet spot during her first week of base duty, a place where she could think without the constant noise of helicopters and radio chatter. The garden was nothing special, just a few hardy plants that somehow managed to grow in the harsh desert environment, but it gave her peace. She pulled out the letter she had been writing to her sister back home in Texas. "Dear Maria," it began, "I know you keep asking when I'm coming home, and, honestly, I'm starting to think that might be soon." The words felt heavy as she wrote them. Leaving the military had never been in her plans. She had joined straight out of nursing school, driven by a desire to serve her country and help soldiers in their darkest moments. The injury had changed everything. Physical therapy had helped her walk again, but the doctors were clear she would never be cleared for active combat duty. The limp would slow her down, make her a burden to teams that needed to move quickly in dangerous situations. Logically, she understood their reasoning. Emotionally, it felt like her purpose had been ripped away. That afternoon, Sarah was updating medical inventory records when she noticed something unusual in the supply closet. Several critical medications were running low, medications that field teams desperately needed. She had been tracking usage patterns for weeks and realized that current ordering procedures weren't keeping up with demand. Without these medications, soldiers could die from treatable injuries. She spent the next 3 hours creating a detailed analysis of medication usage, supply chains, and recommended changes to prevent shortages. It was tedious work that required her to cross-reference hundreds of records, but Sarah found herself absorbed in the task. For the first time in weeks, she felt useful. Her military training had taught her to find solutions, and this was a problem she could actually solve. When Colonel Harris reviewed her report the next morning, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "This is excellent work, Martinez. How did you identify these patterns?" Sarah explained her analysis, watching as the colonel's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. He asked detailed questions about her recommendations and took notes on her responses. "I'm forwarding this to headquarters," he said finally. This kind of logistical insight could save lives across multiple bases. It was the first time in months that Sarah had received recognition for her work, and she felt a small spark of the pride she once knew. But, as the day continued, that spark dimmed. Recognition for paperwork, while nice, wasn't the same as saving lives directly. She watched another medical team prepare for departure, their faces focused and determined. Captain Williams gave her a sympathetic smile before boarding the helicopter, but Sarah could see the excitement in her colleagues' eyes. This was what they had all trained for, what they all lived for. That evening, Sarah called her sister from the base phone. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "Maybe it is time to come home. Maybe I could get a job at the hospital in Houston, be closer to family." Maria's voice brightened on the other end of the line. "Oh, Sarah, that would be wonderful. You could have a normal life again, regular hours, no danger. You've done enough for your country." But, as Sarah hung up the phone, she felt empty. A normal life sounded safe and comfortable, but it also sounded like giving up. She had never been someone who gave up easily, but what choice did she have? The military had made it clear that her usefulness in the field was over. She made her way back to her quarters, passing the flight line where helicopters sat silent in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring another day of inventory reports and administrative tasks while others did the work she longed to do. The unfairness of it all pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. In her small room, Sarah looked at the framed photo on her nightstand, her graduation from military medical training, surrounded by her class, all of them young and full of dreams of saving lives and serving their country. She barely recognized the confident young woman in that photo. That person had believed she could make a difference, had been certain that her skills and dedication would always be needed. Now, as she prepared for bed, Sarah wondered if that young woman had been naive. Perhaps her sister was right. Perhaps it was time to accept that her military career was over and find a new path. The thought should have brought relief, but, instead, it only deepened the ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her injured leg. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters returning from evening missions. Soon, medical teams would be treating wounded soldiers, using the skills and training that had once defined Sarah's life. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about the empty desk waiting for her in the morning, or the reports she would file while others answered the call to serve. She had no way of knowing that in just 3 days, everything would change. That a call would come through the radio that would transform her from a forgotten administrative nurse into the most important person on the base. She couldn't imagine that her limp, the source of her shame and limitation, would become irrelevant in the face of a crisis that only she could handle. But, that night, all Sarah knew was the weight of feeling useless, the burden of watching others do the work she loved, and the growing certainty that her time as a military nurse was coming to an end. She fell asleep to the sound of distant helicopters, never suspecting that soon those same helicopters would be calling her name. The emergency call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Sarah had been awake for 20 minutes, preparing for another day of administrative duties, when the base alarm system pierced the pre-dawn silence. She dressed quickly, her injured leg protesting the sudden movement, and hurried to the medical bay as fast as her limp would allow. The communications center was chaos. Radio operators spoke rapidly into their headsets while officers clustered around maps spread across tables. Colonel Harris was already there, his face grave as he listened to incoming reports. Sarah took her position at the administrative station, but the urgency in the room made it impossible to focus on routine paperwork. "We have a situation," announced Major Thompson, the base communications officer. "A Marine reconnaissance team went missing 3 days ago during a classified operation in the Helmand province. Intelligence just located their position. They're trapped in a mountain cave system, approximately 60 kilometers northeast of here." The briefing that followed painted a grim picture. The 6-man recon team had been gathering intelligence on enemy positions when they were discovered and pursued into the mountains. An avalanche, possibly triggered by explosives, had sealed them inside a network of caves. Initial radio contact had been lost, but a weak signal had been detected using specialized equipment. "Here's the problem," Major Thompson continued, pointing to the map. The terrain is impossible for ground vehicles, and the cave entrance is too narrow for standard helicopter landing. We can get close, but any rescue team will need to rappel down a cliff face and then navigate through unstable cave passages. Sarah listened with growing interest, her administrative work forgotten. This was the kind of complex medical challenge that had drawn her to military nursing. Cave rescues required specialized skills, knowledge of confined space medicine, and the ability to treat patients in extremely difficult conditions. "What's their medical status?" asked Dr. Peterson, the senior medical officer. "Unknown," Thompson replied. "We've had brief radio contact, but transmission quality is poor. We know they're alive, but we don't know about injuries, dehydration, or hypothermia. They've been without supplies for 3 days." Colonel Harris stepped forward. "I'm assembling a rescue team. We need our most experienced cave rescue specialist and our best field medic. The operation launches in 6 hours." Sarah's heart sank as she realized she wouldn't be part of this mission. Her experience with cave medicine was extensive. She had trained with mountain rescue teams before her deployment and had participated in 2 previous cave evacuations. But her leg injury made her ineligible for the dangerous rappelling and cave navigation required. She watched as the team was assembled. Captain Williams would lead the medical response, supported by Lieutenant Chen, who had wilderness medicine training. The rescue specialists were all experienced climbers and cave experts. It was a solid team, but Sarah couldn't help noticing that none of them had her specific experience with cave evacuation medicine. As the morning progressed, Sarah tried to focus on her assigned tasks, but her attention kept drifting to the rescue preparations. She overheard conversations about equipment needs, route planning, and contingency procedures. Several times, she wanted to offer suggestions based on her cave rescue experience, but she held back, knowing it would only highlight her inability to participate. Around midday, the first setback occurred. Captain Williams, while loading medical equipment onto a helicopter, slipped on wet pavement and twisted her ankle severely. Dr. Peterson examined the injury and shook his head. "She can't make the descent. That ankle won't support her weight on ropes." The team quickly reorganized, with Lieutenant Chen taking the lead medical role and Sergeant Brooks joining as additional support. Sarah watched the new team configuration with growing concern. Both medics were competent, but neither had cave rescue experience. They were trained for battlefield medicine, not the unique challenges of treating patients in confined, dark, and potentially unstable underground spaces. "Sir," she finally approached Colonel Harris, her voice hesitant. "I know I'm not cleared for field operations, but I have extensive cave rescue medical training. If the team needs consultation on treatment protocols or equipment modifications." Harris looked at her sympathetically. "I appreciate the offer, Martinez, but you know the regulations. We can't put you in a position where your mobility might compromise the mission or endanger others." Sarah nodded, but frustration burned in her chest. She understood the logic, but she also knew that cave medicine was highly specialized. Treating hypothermia in an underground environment was different from treating it in the field. Managing spinal injuries during cave evacuation required techniques that weren't covered in standard combat medical training. As afternoon turned to evening, more complications arose. Weather reports showed an incoming storm system that would make helicopter operations dangerous after midnight. The rescue window was shrinking rapidly. Additionally, engineers studying the cave system had identified structural instabilities that could cause further collapses if not carefully managed. Sarah spent the evening listening to communications between the rescue team and base command. The team had reached the initial drop point but encountered unexpected difficulties. The cave entrance was smaller than intelligence had indicated, and the interior passages were partially flooded from underground springs. "Base, this is Rescue 1, came Lieutenant Chen's voice over the radio. "We've located the missing team, but we have serious medical issues. 2 casualties with apparent hypothermia, 1 with a suspected spinal injury, and at least 1 with severe dehydration. The confined space is making assessment difficult." Dr. Peterson leaned into the microphone. "Rescue 1, what's your assessment of treatment options?" Base, we're having trouble with standard protocols in this environment. The patient with spinal injury needs immobilization, but our usual techniques aren't working in the cave passages. We need guidance on modified procedures. Sarah found herself moving closer to the radio station, her medical instincts overriding protocol. She knew exactly what procedures Chen needed to use, had trained extensively on spinal immobilization in confined spaces. But she wasn't supposed to be part of this conversation. The next several hours were torture for Sarah. She listened as the rescue team struggled with medical challenges that she could solve easily. When they had trouble maintaining 4 lines in the cold, damp cave environment, she knew techniques to prevent freezing. When they reported difficulties moving an unconscious patient through narrow passages, she had trained extensively on patient packaging for cave rescue. Base, we're running into problems, Chen's voice came through the radio again, strain evident. The hypothermia patients aren't responding to our warming techniques. The cave environment is too cold and wet. We need alternative approaches. Dr. Peterson consulted his medical references, but cave hypothermia was outside his expertise. Sarah watched him flip through manuals, searching for solutions that she already knew. The urge to help was overwhelming, but regulations kept her silent. Around 2,100 hours, the situation deteriorated further. Base, this is Rescue 1. We have a medical emergency. One of the hypothermia patients has gone into cardiac arrest. We're performing CPR, but the cave environment is compromising our efforts. The communications room fell silent except for the crackling radio transmission. Everyone understood that CPR in a cave was exponentially more difficult than in normal conditions. The confined space, irregular surfaces, and cold environment all worked against successful resuscitation. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. Sir, she addressed Dr. Peterson directly, I know techniques for CPR in confined spaces. There are positioning modifications and equipment adjustments that can improve effectiveness. Dr. Peterson looked at her, then at Colonel Harris. The colonel's face was grim as he weighed regulations against the life-threatening emergency unfolding 60 kilometers away. Finally, he nodded. Tell us what you know. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah provided detailed guidance over the radio, walking the cave rescue team through modified medical procedures she had learned during her specialized training. Her instructions helped them successfully resuscitate the cardiac arrest patient and improve treatment for the hypothermia cases. But, as she provided guidance, Sarah realized something troubling. The radio communications were becoming increasingly difficult. The storm was interfering with transmissions, and the cave's location was creating signal dead zones. Soon, the rescue team might be completely cut off from base support. Base, radio quality is deteriorating, Chen confirmed her fears. We're losing you intermittently. If this gets worse, we'll be operating without guidance. Sarah looked at the weather reports and cave maps spread across the table. The storm would peak around midnight and continue for several hours. The rescue team would be on their own during the most critical phase of the evacuation, trying to move seriously injured patients through dangerous cave passages without experienced cave medical support. She studied the mission details with growing alarm. The extraction route required navigating 3 particularly difficult passages, including one that was barely wide enough for a single person. Moving unconscious and injured patients through these areas would require precise medical management to prevent further injury or death. Sir, Sarah approached Colonel Harris again, her voice more determined. The team is going to lose radio contact soon. They don't have cave rescue medical experience, and they're facing hours of complex patient movement in dangerous conditions. People are going to die. Harris's face was troubled. What are you suggesting, Martinez? Let me join a secondary team, Sarah said quickly. I know my leg limits my mobility, but I can still provide medical support. Put me with your best climbers, people who can help me navigate the difficult passages. My medical knowledge could save those Marines. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, studying the mission parameters and weather reports. Around him, officers watched tensely as he weighed an impossible decision. Send an injured nurse into a dangerous cave system, or leave trapped Marines without the specialized medical support they desperately needed. The radio crackled with another transmission from the cave base. We're having more complications. The spinal injury patient is showing signs of neurological deterioration. We need immediate guidance, but you're breaking up badly. Colonel Harris looked at Sarah, at the mission maps, and at the clock showing how much time remained before the storm would cut all communications. The weight of command had never felt heavier, but sometimes leadership meant making decisions that regulations never anticipated. Martinez, he said finally, how quickly can you be ready to deploy? 20 minutes after Colonel Harris's decision, Sarah found herself strapped into a helicopter alongside 3 elite Marine rescue specialists. Her hands shook slightly as she checked her medical equipment one final time. The specialized cave rescue gear felt familiar yet foreign after months of desk duty, and her injured leg throbbed with each vibration of the aircraft. "Ma'am, you sure about this?" shouted Sergeant Miller over the helicopter noise. He was the team leader, a veteran climber with 15 years of rescue experience. His weathered face showed concern as he watched Sarah adjust the straps around her leg brace. Sarah nodded firmly, though inside she battled waves of uncertainty. "I've done cave rescues before, Sergeant. My leg won't stop me from doing my job." But, even as she said it, she wondered if she was being foolishly prideful. The last 3 months had been spent in air-conditioned offices, not hanging from ropes in mountain caves. The flight took 45 minutes through increasingly turbulent weather. Lightning flashed in the distance, and the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets with regular weather updates. Storms moving faster than predicted. We've got maybe 2 hours before conditions become too dangerous for extraction. As they approached the rescue site, Sarah could see the first helicopter on a narrow mountain ledge below. The cave entrance was a dark slash in the rock face, accessible only by a treacherous descent down a near vertical cliff. She watched the Marines studying the route, their faces serious as they planned her descent. "All right, ma'am," Miller explained as they landed, "we're going to rig a special harness system for you. Corporal Jackson here is our best rope technician, he'll manage your descent. Your job is to focus on the medicine and let us handle everything else." The next 30 minutes were a blur of equipment checks and route planning. Sarah's leg made the standard rappelling techniques impossible, but Jackson devised a modified system using additional anchor points and a controlled descent device that would compensate for her limited mobility. It wasn't elegant, but it would work. "Remember," Miller coached as they prepared for descent, "if your leg becomes a problem, you signal immediately. We can't have you becoming a casualty we need to rescue too." The descent began at 2,145 hours, just as the storm reached the mountain. Rain made the rock faces slippery, and wind gusts threatened to slam them against the cliff. Sarah's modified harness held her securely, but the psychological challenge of hanging from ropes after months of ground-based duty was overwhelming. Halfway down, her injured leg cramped severely. The pain shot through her like electricity, and, for a moment she thought she might black out. "Hold position," Jackson called, sensing her distress. They hung motionless against the rock face while Sarah breathed through the spasm, rainwater running down her face. "I'm okay," she called finally, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Keep going." The cave entrance was everything the reports had described and worse. The opening was barely shoulder width, and, immediately inside, the passage narrowed further before opening into a larger chamber. Sarah could hear voices echoing from deep within the cave system, medical team members calling out patient status updates. "Cave Rescue Team, this is Angel 6, Sarah spoke into her radio as they entered the cave system. She had chosen the call sign years ago during her first cave rescue training, never imagining she would use it again under these circumstances. "Angel 6, this is Rescue 1, Lieutenant Chen's relieved voice came back immediately. "Thank God you're here. We have 5 Marines in various stages of hypothermia, 1 with suspected spinal cord injury, and 1 who went into cardiac arrest 40 minutes ago. We got him back, but he's unstable." Sarah and her team navigated through the initial passages, her leg forcing them to move slower than planned. Each step required careful placement to avoid slipping on the wet rock, and the confined spaces made her limp more pronounced. But, as they moved deeper into the cave system, Sarah felt her medical instincts taking over. The scene that greeted them in the main chamber was organized chaos. Lieutenant Chen and his team had done excellent work establishing a makeshift medical station using their equipment and emergency lighting. 6 Marines were laid out on thermal blankets, with 4 lines running and vital signs being monitored as much as possible in the difficult conditions. "Give me a status report," Sarah said, immediately switching into medical command mode. Despite her physical limitations, her voice carried the authority of her 8 years of military medical experience. Patient 1 Corporal Davies, spinal injury from falling rocks, possible paralysis below T6. Patient 2 Private Johnson, severe hypothermia, core temp probably around 90 degrees. Patient 3. Chen rattled through the list efficiently, but Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. He had been managing a complex multi-patient scenario in impossible conditions for hours. Sarah began her assessments, moving methodically from patient to patient. Her injured leg made it difficult to kneel and rise repeatedly, but Jackson stayed close, offering support when needed without making her feel helpless. The other Marines had rigged additional lighting and organized equipment to make her work easier. "The hypothermia cases are our immediate concern," Sarah announced after completing her evaluations. "The cave temperature is only about 45 degrees, and they're losing body heat faster than we can replace it. We need to modify our warming techniques for this environment." She spent the next hour implementing cave-specific medical protocols that none of the other medics had encountered. Standard warming blankets were ineffective in the cold, damp cave, so she directed the construction of improvised heat retention chambers using emergency blankets and body heat from uninjured team members. "Davies needs spinal immobilization for transport," Sarah told the team as she examined the paralyzed Marine. "But standard backboards won't work in these passages. We need to package him differently." She designed a modified immobilization system using available equipment and cave-specific techniques she had learned during specialized training. Around midnight, the radio communications with base finally failed completely. The storm overhead had intensified, and the cave's location created a complete communications blackout. Sarah felt a moment of panic as she realized they were now completely isolated, responsible for multiple critically injured patients with no outside support. "It's just us now," she told the combined team. "But we have everything we need. We stick to the plan, move carefully, and get everyone out alive." The evacuation process was the most challenging medical operation of Sarah's career. Moving 6 injured patients through narrow, unstable cave passages required constant medical management. The hypothermic patients needed regular warming breaks. Davies required careful monitoring for signs of spinal shock. The cardiac arrest patient remained unstable and could deteriorate at any moment. Sarah's leg became increasingly problematic as the night progressed. The cold cave environment made her joints stiffer, and the irregular terrain challenged her balance repeatedly. But each time she stumbled or needed support, the Marine rescue specialists were there to help, never making her feel like a burden. "Ma'am, you're doing incredible work," Miller told her during a brief rest while they negotiated a particularly difficult passage. "These Marines would be dead without your cave medicine knowledge." At 0245 hours, they reached the most dangerous part of the evacuation, a passage barely wide enough for a single person that connected the main chamber to the cave entrance. Moving unconscious patients through this area required precise coordination and constant medical monitoring. "Davies goes first," Sarah decided. "He's stable, but we need to watch for pressure sores from the immobilization device. Then, Johnson, his hypothermia is improving, but he's still at risk for cardiac complications." One by one, they moved the patients through the narrow passage. Sarah positioned herself at the midpoint, monitoring each Marine as they passed, adjusting 4 lines, checking breathing, and ensuring that the movement wasn't causing additional injuries. Her leg throbbed constantly, but she focused completely on her patients. The final challenge was reaching the cave entrance and preparing patients for the vertical evacuation up the cliff face. Sarah had to determine which patients could safely endure the stress of being lifted in rescue baskets and which needed additional stabilization before the ascent. As dawn approached, she looked up through the cave entrance to see the first hints of gray light. The storm was beginning to clear, which meant helicopter evacuation would soon be possible. They had successfully moved 6 critically injured Marines through one of the most difficult cave rescue operations imaginable.
Angel 6, this is base operations, a voice suddenly crackled through the radio as communications resumed. Do you copy?
Sarah grabbed the radio with trembling hands.
Base, this is Angel 6. We have 6 patients ready for extraction.
All are stable and packaged for vertical evacuation.
Copy, Angel 6. Helicopter inbound for extraction in 15 minutes.
As she heard the distant sound of approaching helicopters, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Her leg was screaming in pain, her uniform was soaked and muddy, and she had pushed herself beyond what anyone thought possible. But, looking at the 6 Marines she had helped save, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt like herself again. The helicopters appeared above the cave entrance just as the sun broke through the dispersing storm clouds. As rescue baskets were lowered to extract the patients, Sarah realized that someone on the radio was calling for her specifically. Angel 6, this is Marine Command.
We need you to identify yourself for commendation records.
Sarah looked up at the helicopters circling overhead, their rotors creating a thunderous symphony that seemed to celebrate the successful mission. For the first time in months, she wasn't watching others do the work she loved. She had proven that her skills, experience, and dedication still mattered, even with her limitations. Marine Command, this is Nurse Sarah Martinez, call sign Angel 6, she responded, her voice strong despite her exhaustion.
Mission accomplished.
The helicopter evacuation took 2 hours, with Sarah remaining at the cave site until the last Marine was safely airborne. As the final rescue basket lifted Corporal Davies toward the waiting aircraft, she allowed herself a moment to sit on a rocky outcrop and process what had just happened. Her leg throbbed mercilessly, and every muscle in her body ached from the night's exertion.
Ma'am, you ready for your ride up? Sergeant Miller asked, approaching with the final evacuation harness.
His respect for her was obvious in his voice. The same Marines who had worried about her mobility 12 hours earlier now looked at her with genuine admiration. The ascent to the helicopter was the most challenging part of Sarah's entire ordeal. Her injured leg, pushed beyond its limits during the cave rescue, could barely support her weight as she was lifted up the cliff face. But, as she rose above the mountain terrain, she could see all 4 helicopters in formation, carrying the Marines she had helped save toward definitive medical care. Back at Camp Bastion, word of the rescue operation had spread throughout the base. As Sarah's helicopter touched down, she was surprised to see a crowd waiting near the landing pad. Colonel Harris was there, along with Dr. Peterson and many of the medical staff she worked with daily. But, what shocked her most was seeing Marines from various units, many of whom she didn't recognize, standing at attention. Ma'am, one young Marine approached as she limped down from the helicopter, I just wanted to thank you.
Davies is my squad leader. What you did tonight, we won't forget it.
The next few hours passed in a blur of medical debriefings, mission reports, and status updates on the rescued Marines. All 6 patients were stable and responding well to treatment. Davies showed signs of sensation returning to his legs, suggesting his spinal injury might not be permanent. The hypothermia cases were recovering well, and the cardiac arrest patient was conscious and alert. Sarah was examined by Dr. Peterson, who expressed concern about the strain she had placed on her injured leg. X-rays showed no new damage, but the inflammation and swelling would require several days of rest and elevation. You pushed yourself too hard, he said gently.
But, I understand why you did it.
As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah found herself back at her desk in the medical bay, but the atmosphere was completely different. Fellow nurses stopped by regularly to congratulate her and hear details about the cave rescue. Medical teams preparing for missions sought her advice on specialized scenarios.
She no longer felt invisible or forgotten.
Martinez, I need to speak with you, Colonel Harris called from his office.
Sarah limped over, uncertain what to expect. Was she in trouble for exceeding her medical limitations? Would there be disciplinary action for participating in an operation she technically wasn't cleared for?
Sit down, Harris said, his expression serious but not angry. I've been on the phone with Marine Command for the past 2 hours.
They want a full report on your role in the rescue operation.
He paused, studying her face. They also want to discuss your future assignments. Sarah felt her heart sink.
"Sir, am I being transferred? I know I violated protocols by participating in field operations."
"Quite the opposite," Harris interrupted.
"Command is recommending you for a Bronze Star for your actions last night.
But, more importantly, they're offering you a position developing new cave rescue medical protocols for the entire Marine Corps."
The words hit Sarah like a physical blow.
A Bronze Star was a significant military honor, recognizing heroic achievement in combat situations. But, the opportunity to develop training protocols meant her cave rescue experience could help save lives across the entire military. The position would be based here initially, Harris continued, but would involve travel to train rescue teams at bases worldwide. "Your injury wouldn't disqualify you from this role. In fact, your experience overcoming physical limitations while maintaining medical effectiveness makes you uniquely qualified." Sarah sat quietly for several moments, processing this unexpected turn in her career. 3 days ago, she had been considering leaving the military entirely. Now she was being offered a chance to turn her specialized knowledge into a resource that could save countless lives. "There's something else," Harris added. "The Marines you rescued last night, they've requested permission to visit you before they're transferred to Germany for additional treatment."
Davies specifically asked to thank Angel 6 personally.
An hour later, Sarah sat in the hospital ward as 6 Marines in various stages of recovery were wheeled or walked to her bedside. Corporal Davies, despite being immobilized in a spinal board, was conscious and alert. His eyes filled with tears as he saw her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my wife is 7 months pregnant with our first child.
Because of what you did last night, I'm going to be there when my daughter is born. I don't know how to thank you for that." Private Johnson, still recovering from severe hypothermia, squeezed her hand weakly. "When we heard Angel 6 was coming into the cave, we knew we were going to make it. You gave us hope when we thought we were going to die in there." Each Marine had a similar story, expressing gratitude not just for the medical treatment but for the courage she had shown in coming after them despite her own limitations. Sarah realized that her limp, which she had seen as a weakness that ended her career, had become irrelevant in the face of her determination to save lives. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into developing the new cave rescue medical protocols. She worked with engineers to design modified equipment, collaborated with climbing specialists to create safety procedures, and wrote detailed training manuals based on her experience. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways she hadn't experienced since before her injury. The Bronze Star ceremony took place 6 weeks later, with Sarah's sister flying in from Texas to attend. As she stood before the assembled Marines receiving the commendation, Sarah thought about how drastically her life had changed. The injury that had seemed to end her career had actually led her to discover a new purpose. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, the citation read, "Nurse Martinez displayed extraordinary courage and medical expertise in conditions of extreme danger, directly saving the lives of 6 Marines through her specialized knowledge and selfless service." But, beyond the formal recognition, Sarah had received something more valuable, the knowledge that her limitations didn't define her capabilities. Her injured leg would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the end of her story. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a training facility in Colorado, teaching a group of Marine medics advanced cave rescue techniques. Her limp was still noticeable, but none of the trainees saw it as a weakness. They saw her as Angel 6, the nurse who had rappelled into a mountain cave to save trapped Marines. "Remember," she told her students as they practiced patient packaging techniques, "in cave rescue situations, adaptability is more important than perfect mobility. Sometimes the obstacles we face, whether environmental or personal, force us to find better solutions than we would have discovered otherwise." As the training session ended, Sarah received a message on her radio. "Angel 6, this is Marine Base Hawaii. We have a cave emergency situation and need your immediate consultation." Sarah smiled as she reached for her response microphone. A year ago, she had thought her military medical career was over. Now, Marines across the world called her when they needed expertise that only she could provide. Her call sign Angel 6 had become synonymous with hope in impossible situations. "Marine Base Hawaii, this is Angel 6, she responded. "I'm ready to assist." The young Marines in her training class watched with admiration as their instructor prepared to help save more lives.
They saw not a nurse with a limp, but a hero who had proven that true strength comes from refusing to let limitations define your impact on the world. Sarah had learned that sometimes the things we think disqualify us from our dreams actually prepare us for purposes we never imagined. Her injured leg had ended one chapter of her military career, but it had opened another that would touch more lives and make a greater impact than she had ever thought possible. As she prepared her consultation for the emergency in Hawaii, Sarah thought about the letter she had been writing to her sister a year ago, the one where she had considered leaving the military. She had never sent that letter. Instead, she had written a different one describing her Bronze Star ceremony and her new role training rescue teams. Dear Maria, that letter had begun. You asked when I was coming home, and I finally have an answer. I am home. I'm exactly where I belong, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most meaningful destinations. The radio crackled with additional details about the Hawaiian emergency, and Sarah began formulating her response. Somewhere in a cave system thousands of miles away, Marines were trapped and hoping for rescue. They didn't know that their salvation might come from the guidance of a limping nurse who had once thought her career was over. But Sarah knew, and as she began coordinating the rescue effort, she felt the familiar surge of purpose that came from serving others. Her injury had taught her that being useful wasn't about being perfect, it was about being willing to serve despite your limitations. Angel 6 was ready to answer the call once again.